Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Muir. He is the author of the book Cop Cop, Breaking the Fixed System of American Policing. He is a former senior investigator who exposed wrongdoing in New York as part of the Civil Complaint Review Board. So welcome, Mac.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, you guys, you and your co-author, Greg Finch, just released a book a few months ago, kind of on your experience. Why don't you give us a little bit of background of how this came about?
Investigated NYPD misconduct for 7 years. Started out as an investigator, moved my way up the ranks, became a supervisor, and then I went on to run the police oversight agency in Oakland, California. But as we were doing the work, really, the two of us were partners on various assignments, and we're realizing we were in a universe that had never really been documented from the inside. We're interviewing officers on a regular basis about allegations of misconduct, and we're speaking to hundreds of victims of police misconduct. And once 2020 came around, there was a huge frustration from our staff. It was about 200 people who work, 250 people who work at the CCRB in New York. And you could see, interviewing the officers every day and speaking to the victims of misconduct, that the conversation we were having around policing was disconnected from what was happening on the street. So that began to motivate putting together these stories. Fortunately, in 2020, a law passed in New York that made it so that a lot of these records were public. And we were able to speak to the process of doing those investigations, give insights to the stories, and also put together really the narrative of what was going on wrong in policing on the inside, because the devil's in the details. And we were seeing the details on an everyday basis and wanted to let folks know, like, this is what's actually happening, and it's a rigged system.
Explain to me kind of the difference between the public perception and what you actually saw.
Yeah, so in the public conversation, there was a lot of, well, post 2020, the way I describe it is it was really a racial reckoning in America. It was a conversation about race in America. It was an opportunity to assess the disparities in policing. But Derek Chauvin was an outlier as a police officer, and we were seeing everyday policing. And a huge part of what's so horrifying about American policing is it's the everyday injustice. It's the normal stops and frisks. It's the daily fear that you might be surveilled, harassed, stopped, frisked. That's far more likely than actually being killed by a police officer. But that sort of haunting feeling does chase folks who complain about the police, who live in over-policed communities. And also, as we saw this unfolding before our eyes, we saw the ways in which the system in the NYPD in particular, but really around the country, was designed to have officers themselves feel increasingly disconnected from public service. And so we really explore the levels of cynicism, nihilism that build into an officer's career as they're faced with unfair disciplinary processes, having to delve into that. The manipulation of crime statistics. I know that's a big thing in the media right now, as Trump is talking about this, the manipulation of DC crime statistics, sort of underplaying crime. And there's some real concerns there. I disagree with the solution. But all this to say that I think in the narrative of what happened with George Floyd, of course, it was really upsetting, and it was an awful video, and it's good that justice was done to the extent it was with Derek Chauvin. But these incidents are happening usually at a smaller scale all the time. And our system is designed to do that. The system is designed to over-police Black and brown communities. It's designed to make officers resent the public that they serve. And what better way to do it than from the perspective of the people who police the police?
Now, you caught my ear because you said the phrase "everyday injustice," which is of course the name of our show, but it's also kind of what we do. Part of what we do is we put people into the courts to kind of highlight everyday injustice, because just as you said, you don't see George Floyd happening every day. We don't see major injustices necessarily happening in the court system every day. And so we're trying to ferret out some of the systemic injustices, and it's kind of the same thing that you're talking about. So I had to kind of highlight that point that you made. One of the things that I notice when I sit in court is that it's sometimes really darn scary to think that some of these police officers have a badge and a gun because they cannot articulate the law. They can't articulate what it is that they did. And you sit in court listening to them try to justify what they do sometimes, and you're like, wow, this guy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the really beautiful thing about the civilian oversight investigations is whether or not there's disciplinary power, and there is in Oakland and there isn't in New York for the oversight entity. What you're requiring of the officer is them demonstrating the ability to articulate the basis for their actions, which is a big deal. It's not always been required in the justice system. And a great investigation is parsing out not just the retroactive justification, right? You can say that for a stop and frisk, you saw a bulge, so on and so forth. But when you're doing a really quality investigation, you're stepping into the officer's shoes, you're walking through their actions, and so it's less of a cross-examination, but more getting into their state of mind and then seeing whether as they begin to articulate how they progressed through an incident, does that make sense, right? And that's the ultimate difference difference in style between like a courtroom interrogation and what you're doing in civilian oversight is you're really just trying to say what happened here from your perspective, which gives you an empathetic insight, but also I think it exposes failures to articulate or exposes contradictions quite well.
So, what are the biggest problems that you saw?
Yeah, so I mean, there is the everyday injustice. Of course, there are also serious injustices that are violent and disturbing that go entirely unresolved. So I will say, like, that's first and foremost. There's a lot of unnecessary harm that happens in the criminal justice system, and that speaks to the standard for use of force in policing, which is something that's reasonable as opposed to necessary. Right. So we have, and oftentimes you would see an action which isn't technically misconduct, but was it necessary? Did this have to happen this way? So there's the everyday injustice. At the same time, in New York, there are instances of officers using racial slurs, serious uses of force that go remain on in the police department and oftentimes get promoted. What we saw is a general trend of officers who had the highest performance, the most arrests, summonses, were likely to be promoted. And in that way, it insulates those officers from disciplinary action moving forward. And so the broader ability for officers to be not held accountable is a huge issue. We also look at crime statistics, crime stat manipulation, which remains an issue in New York. There have been whistleblowers in the NYPD saying that the crime rate can be manipulated up or down depending on the political will of that situation. And we delve into how that degrades an officer's trust in their own institution of government. So to pinpoint it on one thing, I would just say there's tremendous unnecessary harm going on. And then there are many, many symptoms that come with that problem.
And I completely agree. Often what we'll see is, something bad happen. They open fire, they use their taser, God forbid they kill someone. And often it doesn't meet the legal standard of necessarily a crime, but you watch it and you go, man, this shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, and we delve into that in the book at one point, where an incident where a man is killed by two young officers. I believe they're 22 and 23 years old, showing up to an incident where a guy's just been evicted. He's having what appears to be a mental breakdown. And you look at it, and he tells the officers, shoot me. Um, and they do. And it's a horrible incident on all sides. The officers are clearly distraught. The person is dead. The community is harmed. And the lingering question is like, why did this have to happen this way? I mean, it didn't, but there were so many other factors built in that said that was the only course of action, according to the NYPD at that time. So it can be very frustrating.
And along those lines, and we see so many incidents where it's a mental health call, they're being called in, sometimes it's the family member calling, and I know I've been on this end of it. You're like your kid is out of control, you can't control him. And this happened in our household multiple times. We end up calling the cops reluctantly. And fortunately, the cops kind of know us. We live in a small town, and every time we called the cops, it ended okay. But I always had to hold my breath and go, okay, is this going to be the time where he decides to do something to escalate it? And fortunately, it didn't happen. But and for a while there was talk about, okay, should the police even be the first responders on these mental health calls because they're really not trained. And, I think everybody kind of came to the conclusion at that point in time, talking 2020, 2021, that we're asking police officers to do things that they're really not well equipped to do. Is that your impression as well?
Absolutely. And I think that we're asking officers to enter different scenarios that are going to take a tremendous technical skill at times, tremendous negotiating skill, tremendous empathy, tactical skill, the ability to get into physical altercations without hurting or killing someone unless absolutely necessary, among all the other bureaucratic skills that you need to have, the ability to write reports, the ability to be accurate when you're asked questions. Not many people have that whole package. And it's a unique feature of policing that we would ask a single profession to do everything. So really, we delve into the mental health response and the ways in which that could be a clear value add. I know that's been done before, but I think you see in the cases which haven't been walked through before, these specific examples of a situation where that did this need to happen can be answered by a response from somebody who's not law enforcement. And there are other instances where it's clear that that needs to happen. But even the ability, as you were talking about, the call on the police, the ability of law enforcement to take certain actions draws people to call the police sometimes when it's not necessary. Right. It's something we delve into, borrowing from a Yale study, the idea of situational trust, and that sometimes in communities where there are not other resources, calling the police can be the greatest leverage that you can have in a relationship, whether it's a family member, whether it's someone else. And so they're being called upon into situations where even the caller might know, I'm doing this as a last resort because it's the only resource that's been invested in my community. And you look at the Brownsville, South Bronx, that's certainly the case.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same kind of dilemma a few months ago. It's 3 in the morning. I'm at my office and there's a homeless person, outside that's kind of acting up. And I'm, kind of weighing in my mind, okay, do I call the police? There's no other option. Or do I wait and see what happens and then potentially expose somebody else to this situation when they get to their office? So I decided to call the cop. The cop didn't handle it particularly well.
Mm.
And so after that, I've decided not to call the cops anymore.
Yeah, it's a tough dynamic, but imagining that there was another resource available that you could be assured would not handle it with the in generating those issues, it would be best for all. I see it
Well,
that way.
yeah, and that's exactly it. And there are, but not at 3 in the morning.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the challenge. But that's going to be the institutions that are being built right now, whether it's in LA, whether it's in Denver, whether it's in Oakland, and potentially in New York with Zoran Mamdani proposing this Department of Community Safety. You see the infrastructure being built there. And for me, the key is to frame it again as community safety as opposed to the framework of sort of defund the police, which I don't think is going to be politically viable moving forward. But the sentiment of creating community safety that doesn't need police intervention, I think, is valuable to everyone, including many of the cops who aren't thrilled at the idea of responding to somebody going through a schizophrenic episode and saying, "Hey, can you just figure this out?" Because that's really what appears to be the ask a lot of the time. And who's going to be dealing with that? It's going to be the 25-year-old who's been on the job for a couple of years and who really is not seeing a clear win.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. The idea behind defund the police was, I think, sound. The problem was the slogan lent itself to all sorts of embellishments and exaggeration. The real idea is that there are a lot of situations where you don't need cops, but you need someone. And if you provide community resources, you give me someone to call at 3 in the morning, I'd much rather call them than the cops because I think the cops are kind of a blunt instrument. And it really depends on the cop. Like, I know cops that can handle things really well, and I've seen it. And I know cops that just aren't very good at it.
Absolutely. And I think that's the challenge of the defund framework in the first place, was it's sort of a liberal artsy idea. I mean, full disclosure, I went to liberal arts school, but but it's like when I talked to folks at the time, feeling disenchanted with the framing, it was, well, what we really mean is alternatives to X or improving the quality of Y. And I'm like, what a layperson hears is that 911 isn't coming to your house. And I think that we were all really motivated to have some systemic change post 2020. But I think that that framing, the possibility that no one was going to be responding to your 911 call, uh, blunted the movement, and it really made it so that it was a political question that wasn't so much about how can we improve systems, but when you talk about defunding the police, it's talking about personal safety. And if you're taken away from that, you're losing your argument.
Correct. So I want to get into a couple of these issues, one of which is ComStat. And of course, you were in New York where ComStat was born. I've seen the legacy of ComStat. Um, you know, I'm a data person, so I like the idea of having data-driven solutions, but it seemed like there's a lot of problems with this.
Yeah, so the central challenge you have in just public safety data is that most of the people who are going to drive this, Bloomberg being the key example in New York City, he's coming from the private sector. He's treating this sort of like finance, right? You want to just make sure you quantify everything, you identify your intended objective, and then you push your metrics in that direction. What that led to was more stop and frisk. What that leads to is quotas because you're just identifying, well, if more arrests is good, we need more arrests. And it doesn't necessarily matter what the quality of the arrest is. And that's in the datafication of policing. The challenge you have is this quantity versus quality story, where the quality of an arrest, the constitutionality of an arrest is much more difficult to measure than whether or not the arrest happened. So what we really saw is as these incentives unfolded, you saw that officers are being pressured during stop and frisk to stop more people, to hit their quotas, creates a tremendous rift between the community and law enforcement, creates an ultimately unfair environment for the average person trying to walk to work, and it's an infringement on everyone's civil liberties. At the same time, you see that the officers who are hitting their quotas and who are performing more and more are getting promoted, are potentially getting insulated from discipline because oftentimes what's going to be on your performance evaluation, how many arrests you've made, how many stops you've made, how many tickets you've issued. And when you're facing a disciplinary process, they look at your performance evaluations as a reference for how to discipline you. So even outside of anything nefarious, the more output you have, the more likely you are to be insulated from discipline. And then there are the other sort of political factors that can play into that for any given officer's career. We've got an example of an officer in here who went by the nickname Ass Man, who was notorious in the Bronx for putting his finger on people's butts or up people's butts, strip searching people, et cetera, et cetera. I can't speak to the exact credibility of all that, but what I know is that he had that reputation. And he remained in that precinct for an extended period of time, and he was a very high-performing officer. And you've got to look at these instances where there's this sharp contrast between what we would expect from law enforcement and the accountability measures that are taking place. And we really examine like how could you change this? Because although there's the sort of gory, just looking at the system and being sort of disappointed in what's taken place, there are really clear positive outcomes that could be coming out of what we're learning from civilian oversight and the transparency that comes with new changes in state laws.
And the other problem with this stat-driven metric is kind of the over-policing of certain neighborhoods and certain areas of town. Because obviously, and let's use drugs as a perfect example, right? If you're in the poorer parts of town, people are using drugs on the street, they're selling drugs on the street. Whereas if you're in the wealthier parts of town, the drug use is probably about the same according to all the data and studies and everything, but it's happening inside people's houses, and so it's not getting, enforced the same way. And so you drive policing to these marginal communities.
And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? When we invest more in policing than education, than healthcare, than childcare, and so these communities become increasingly depressed, and then the response is that there's additional crime, there's additional disorder, as the police departments would describe it, and then the response is more policing. You combine that, you overlay it with the political rhetoric and we point the finger at Bloomberg, we point the finger at other members of the NYPD, of folks in white communities fearing being in these black communities that they're never going to go to, and driving this idea that, oh, it's very dangerous there, when they're not the ones who are actually experiencing these conditions, but the general idea that in your city something bad might be happening drives a lot of bad policy too.
So in your conclusion, you guys lay out six solutions or suggestions or proposals for reform. And I want to actually spend a little time and just go down this list and talk to you about these because they're interesting. So the first one really jumps out, hiring more women in policing.
Absolutely. And what I'd like to do is just frame this for you for a second, David, is that so this isn't so much a policy book. This is a stepping into the shoes of a civilian oversight professional, but it's a regular people in an extraordinary world story. So it's in some ways narrative nonfiction. So you're dropped into what is it like to investigate police misconduct, and these are the conclusions that you draw from that experience and that we drew, but it's a snapshot in time from that perspective. And one thing that we saw over and over again is that female officers were less likely to be subject to complaints. Female officers, the studies over the years have shown that they are less likely to be involved in the networks of misconduct that often do the most harm. And that they're actually one stat that really jumps out for you is that male officers are less likely to use force in the presence of female officers, which is a real stunner. There are all these incentives to hire more women and to create a culture that allows for women to exist. I think that's the double-edged sword there, is when I've spoken to folks before, they'll go, well, Mac, do you want police departments to hire more women to be in a toxic environment? So I think it's not only incumbent on police departments to hire more women, but to create environments where there's protection from any sort of office workplace harassment, when there's a strong whistleblowing component to your department. And that's certainly where we delve into some of the later proposals. But women in policing is a clear solution. And I say this, there was an NYPD lieutenant who went on to get a law degree and a PhD and did many surveys on policing. And he's fantastic author, Arthur Niederhofer. And he really concludes that the main thing shaping police behavior at its worst is just that it's groups of men. And it seems too simple, but it isn't. It's when groups of men have the ability to control people's bodies with relatively little oversight, bad things are going to happen.
And it's really interesting because what we found for the most part, for a long time, people were saying, well, hire more officers of color. And most of the research on that shows that doesn't create as much of an effect as we thought it would.
No, I think yeah, there's just not the outcomes that you would expect, and that were promised during that time. It's always unfair to point to one individual incident, but you look at what happened in Memphis, you look at these very specific violent incidents where what shapes a police officer's career is the culture of the police department, first and foremost. And it takes a really remarkable vigilance to have your own independent identity from that, and you're ultimately going to be pushed away from that department's core culture. So, where you see the real disruption is for women in policing, because that's it. There are own subcultures that develop in that environment that are distinct from men, again, policing people's bodies.
which is again really interesting. Second, you talk about ending the war on drugs and low-level offense policing, which seems like a no-brainer to me.
Yeah, it was one where we had two minds on this in that it is a no-brainer. Is it worth d delving into that in a book? Because I think for so many, we're already there. But there needs to be an acknowledgement that the war on drugs is continuing. And I
It's
think,
re-escalating.
yeah, and that I think you're right. The Obama administration just decided to not use the term anymore. They didn't say it was over. They just were like, we're not going to use that language any further. And there's just a tremendous amount of harm that occurs because it is still going on. It is still doing harm, and so we call it out through the framework of prohibition, and really that's what it is. And we look at the increase in violence during prohibition, and say like this is what we are doing to our own communities, and we continue to do. And as you know, much of the basis for prohibitions on drugs in the United States have been highly racialized, going back to Chinese immigrants, going back to Mexican folks in California. And so the eye needs to remain on the ball there. But I think we all know the fundamental premise.
Next, creating violence reduction mediators.
No, it's so this speaks to it's an odd coincidence that Zoran Mamdani is sort of proposing a version of this. But the idea of having a violence reduction agency has been building up across the country. LA has its own Department of Violence Prevention. Oakland has its own Department of Violence Prevention. Having mediators is part of that. I'm a professional mediator. I really believe in the process, and we speak to it later in sort of truth and reconciliation approach. But having alternatives to police showing up to incidents, and even in situations where there are just conflicts that don't merit arrests, there's a conundrum where like police cost a lot to have for cities to have, and they have only so many tools at their disposal. We look at the lens of violence prevention in the classic idea that you're going to be going and targeting the folks who are most likely to be involved in violence, and encouraging them through positive incentives to not participate in violent cycles of violence moving forward. We look at alternative responses, and then the different dynamic ways you can approach that, whether it's mental health response or to conflicts that don't quite rise to the level of the need for police intervention.
This one's interesting. Civilianizing internal affairs oversight.
Yeah, so full disclosure, so I was the director of the Community Police Review Agency in Oakland for a couple years, and that was a big part of the process that we were going through, was actually teeing the city up to civilianize internal affairs. There are a lot of challenges to that process. Oftentimes, in terms of staffing, one of the interesting things you find is that in a civilian oversight agency, just hiring somebody, you got to find somebody with the investigative expertise who's usually not law enforcement, and that can be a hassle because it's a relatively small profession. In a police department, let's say you have somebody in internal affairs who retires, you just put in another officer. So that's the main impediment. That aside, here are the upsides. Police officers want a fair disciplinary process. And in my experience, particularly in New York, internal affairs is a political tool used by a police department to reward friends of the leadership of the department and to punish people who are willing to speak up against things they don't believe in. And so the the goal for me in the Serpico sort of vision of can we create an environment where the good police officer can thrive and the bad police officer fears the good one, not the other way around. Civilianizing internal affairs is a big part of that solution. So We speak to the upsides of civilian oversight, not just that, but in the quality of an investigation. You know, you hear the catch-all, like, did you fear for your safety? Is sort of leading questions that might lead an officer to exonerate themselves and not have that really scrutinized. Where in oversight, at its best, you're not interrogating the officer, but what you are offering is a non-biased approach to fact-finding and understanding whether harm was done, whether the police action was within policy, and whether discipline needs to occur. So really, I continue to strongly believe that that's the path moving forward. There is not quite any department in the U.S. that has that framework right now, although
I
the
was just about to ask that
yeah,
question.
yeah. So the strongest oversight in the country right now is going to be in Chicago, and I would say Oakland's probably independently more powerful in the sense that there's a significant disciplinary authority. But in Chicago, you have a large police oversight entity. When there is a shooting, for example, there's a van with civilian oversight investigators who show up and they take the body cam off the officer and they watch the video first and then they interview the officer, right? That's real transparency, accountability. The police oversight entity will hold a press conference, release the body cam footage, and they'll be coming forward and saying, hey, we want to be a source of credibility here, and we're going to make sure that everybody's playing fair in the process. I continue to be really impressed by what they're doing, and a difference between them and everywhere else is that Chicago, unlike other cities, when the DOJ came in there, they pointed to civilian oversight and they wrote civilian oversight into the success plan for the city. And that changes the dynamic entirely, where what you have in other cities is the DOJ comes in and they say, okay, here are the qualifications, here are the numbers you got to hit, and here are the metrics moving forward. It doesn't build a city up for success moving forward. And so when you write that into the story, when you say civilian oversight is going to be court when DOJ leaves, then you can build a future that is actually going to have a meaningful impact.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that it's Chicago. I mean, you have the whole John Burge torture scandal, and then you kind of have this secondary thing after Laquan McDonald and all that information came out. So the fact that Chicago is kind of leading the way is ironic.
Yeah, well, they after Laquan McDonald, they really just needed to get their act together, and I think that for me, the question for any community is, and wherever you are, if you're watching, if you want police accountability in your community, the first thing is to identify what you want, and the second thing is to actually go and draft out what it would look like in law, because there are these incidents that take place, and the goal isn't to begin having the conversation once that incident takes place. It's to have your conversation finalized and drafted. And what happened in Oakland, for example, is when there was a major sex scandal, as you know, the citizens had already drafted up an entire reframing of the police oversight system. And they said, okay, now's the time. And then it passed with 83, 84% of the vote. And so I think being responsive to those situations and being proactive about those situations is so important to moving the ball forward, because if you decide to have that conversation about civilian oversight, about police accountability, only after the incident has occurred, there's so many ways to delay the process. And you found that in New York. I mean, in the de Blasio administration, over and over again, it was, okay, we're going to have meetings about meetings about meetings, absent progress. And then sure enough, it's 8 years later and not much has changed.
Right. So then you have tearing down the blue wall of silence, which, obviously is a huge problem, but there's not an obvious solution to that in my
Well, it's
mind.
it's a unique challenge in California in particular. I mean, we saw some real progress. There was Civil Rights Law 50A that existed in New York, which was just rescinded, I believe, a month or two after George Floyd was murdered. But what you see in California is there are laws that prevent the release of personnel records, SB 1421. I could delve into the weeds, but California is one of the least transparent states in the country on police personnel records.
Yep.
And one of the absurdities of that, I find, is that when an officer is exonerated, it's much harder to get the records relating to the discipline or relating to the disciplinary process. You can't get the report on what occurred and so on. And that means that there are many ways one might conceal wrongdoing. There's just a lack of transparency in the quality of the investigations that are occurring. And you would think that in a reasonable system, when an officer was exonerated, we would have the opportunity to examine that and, hey, celebrate it if it was really the right thing that occurred. Instead, it disappears. And the San Francisco Chronicle did a really amazing job profiling ways in which officers were essentially able to agree to like plea deals in their disciplinary processes in such a way that that the records would not be made public because the category of record slightly changed, and then they get rehired in another department. Uh, I don't know how you can build community trust in the long term in that sort of environment.
Yeah, and we also saw, the informant scandal in Orange County, which took, a decade to unfurl, and I still don't know that we know everything about that.
No, and that's the problem in California is so often there's no way to know uh, where it ends because there are so many issues of transparency. But that's going to be a responsibility of the legislature, and the goal. If there's a meaningful attempt, even by police departments, police unions, to improve community trust with policing, I think that transparency is absolutely in order. And what it also does is it protects the law enforcement that is really doing the right thing. You want transparency left and right, right? You can be concerned about being second guessed. You see that argument made, absolutely. But you also want to just be able to say, like, this is what happened. It's a tough environment, and I'm here to stand in the public eye because I am a public servant. That's certainly what you have to do in any other government role.
And then finally, the truth and reconciliation model, and I'm a big fan of that, by the way. I mean, I saw what happened in South Africa, and I've read a number of books on that. I'm a big believer that that is really a way to go.
Yeah, so this is really born from, I mean, I can remember the first time I started thinking about this was I had a case where a woman had filed a complaint and she just cried in the interview room, and we sat there for well over an hour, and she was having a really tough time managing what had occurred. And it was something that we would generally think of as relatively minor on the scale of police misconduct. Stop, frisk, maybe somebody was rude. And I remember interviewing the officer, and they were so confused as to why they were even there. And so the interview goes on, and they continue to be like, I don't get why this person filed a complaint. I thought it was a great interaction. I thought I was doing my job. And there are a million little pieces of the everyday injustice that I do think there is a good faith missing link there, where there are often times where it's just there's like a total lack of awareness of the potential harm, especially when you're hardened to the everyday harm that's done, right? You see somebody get arrested or taken to a mental health hospital, and so you as an officer might be kind of rude to somebody and then let them go and then be like, that was awesome. We really get that was a best case outcome where the harm is not so much in the harm is in the perception of the fairness of what took place, and you lose that as an officer over time when you see so many unfair things happen, and so many times where you go, this should have been handled differently.
Yeah, and one thing we did here was what's called a circle process. It's a restorative justice term where, you can get the police officers to agree to sit down with the complainant, and they both kind of share their stories about what they saw, and they kind of talk it through. And so, there doesn't end up usually being discipline. What there ends up being is kind of this understanding, and both sides kind of walk away learning something.
Yeah, so when I was in Oakland, we got about a $250,000 grant to build a mediation program, which I understand they're still trying to get the final touches on. But a challenge in Oakland, for example, was that you have so much distrust in the process that some folks are not willing to participate in that, and that there can be like institutional resistance, a concern that a mediation program, and we highlight the double-edged sword here in New York, is that sometimes a case can be mediated when it actually should lead to disciplinary action. And so that's something that needs to be balanced. But more broadly, I think in the Truth and Reconciliation story, the voices of the everyday complainants are not heard in a public forum nearly enough. And I think also the average officer is not heard from nearly as often as we might think, right? We hear from the police union, we hear from the chief of police, we hear from the occasional retired officer, but the officers on the street I found have a much more dynamic perspective than some of these sort of rote roles that we interface with. And I think that's one of the challenges with police unions. Not to say I'm sort of an abolish police union thing. I think the problems persist whether or not there are police unions. You can look at the states where there aren't unions and see, okay, this still exists. But elevating those voices and having them be heard by the community, not as PR, but really like, what is my experience as a police officer and how can it be improved? When I had those private conversations, I got a much more dynamic understanding of the challenges officers faced and the ways in which there's a lot more common ground, I believe, than our current conversation offers. So that's what we speak to, different ways in which that could be approached. Chicago, the police torture project was a huge part of that too. There was a real truth and reconciliation approach, and people need to know what happened. And in our cases in New York, we were looking at a lot of instances where it was like nobody's ever going to know about this. That was the de facto starting point, and that's exhausting for everybody involved.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time. I want to thank you for coming on. Can you share with folks how to get your book?
Yeah, so we're available on Amazon. You can follow us on Instagram. We're at CopCopHQ, and we're happy to answer any questions about the book, about police oversight. If you're interested in investing in police accountability in your community, we're happy to partner on that and give you some hot tips on how to approach it. And Amazon, Barnes and Noble, we're around. So check us out. And thanks so much, David. Really appreciate you for having me on.
We've been talking with Muir. He and Greg Finch wrote the book Cop Cop, Breaking the Fixed System of American Policing. We've been talking about all the issues around policing. And this is current events as we've watched unfold in DC. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.